Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Digital Leaders Show. We're live every other week at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific, talking key issues and news at the intersection of business and technology, with a special focus on automation, AI, and digital transformation in hopes of making you a better digital leader. Today, we're discussing AI governance and staying ahead of the compliance curve in 2024 with the former Director of Emerging Technology Policy at the Department of Homeland Security, as well as the past Chief Innovation Officer at the FDIC. Plus, we'll talk headlines for digital leaders from the world of enterprise technology. I'm Dan Goodstein. I head up the Institute for RPA and AI, as well as the Digital Enterprise Institute. We're a professional association, media, peer-to-peer research network, providing education, networking, and advice to over 130,000 members worldwide, all around automation, enterprise AI, and digital transformation. You can get more information at irpaai.com. My co-host is Chris Cerdak. He's an author, advisor, former advisor from the White House Chief Transformation Office, automation and AI practice lead at EY, and former executive partner of digital transformation at Gartner. Chris, good to see you again.
Yeah, how are you? Staying warm.
Finally. Well, I can't complain. You live in New York and you get these things. Not like you Californians, but it's a heat wave today. It's 40 degrees and I'm comfortable.
Yeah, here in Southern California, we get a little rain and people hide under their dining room table.
I know it. Yeah, I heard Texas this week was cold. People were like freaking out, right? It was below freezing. So,
well, what's interesting there, I was actually just seeing an article about that where, a couple of years ago, we had the power system failure because of the cold spell in Texas. And because of that, they actually have made a wide range of changes to the power grid there. And as a result, they got through it fine this time. So live and learn.
Positive news. I like it. Yeah. I like it. So, Chris, you've been busy. You've been writing a bunch. What's kind of top of your mind this week?
Well, and it really leads into what we're going to be discussing with my new compatriots with Frontier Foundry. And I find everybody is just completely wrapped around the tire or the wheel of AI governance. It's the topic everyone's getting into. Lots of new frameworks are coming out globally. A lot of similarities between them, a lot of differences. But without a question, with all the discussions and meetings and so forth I've been part of in certainly January, everybody's talking about AI governance. Now, what I think is going to be interesting in this discussion we're about to have is, okay, is that a blip? Is that the fashion of the week and we're moving on to something else in February, or is it something meaningful getting through 2024?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, there's a lot of really interesting things. Kind of, I see them as kind of all coming together. I saw this really disturbing stat from a Gallup poll that said U.S. businesses lost almost $2 trillion in productivity last year as a result of disengaged employees. And that 85% of Americans are looking for a new job this year. So you add that to the AI everywhere. You can't even go into seems like a bathroom these days. We were joking about last week without AI being in your life. And then at the same time, more job cuts in the news, especially in the tech space. I think Google's up to 12,000 jobs cut since January since last January. Amazon's down 25,000 jobs last year. And then, not just tech, the LA Times announced a 20% job cut, Wayfair this week. So, you have these kind of multiple forces going on. It just makes you wonder, what's, is this just like you say, kind of a blip, or is this really a change, an impact change?
What's actually interesting, I spoke at a conference in Colombia in spring of 2022, and those numbers you just talked about, the percentage of workforce disengaged and the percent looking for a new job was actually higher back then. So those numbers actually make it sound maybe it's a little bit better. But yeah, it brings to mind the question of what is productivity, what does contribute to economic growth? Is it merely the consumption side, or do we need to be productive? And a lot of organizations, driving up of interest rates means that money isn't free anymore. What is it? Something like a third of the S&P 500 are considered zombie companies. They actually don't produce more than they consume in terms of their financial performance. So I think a lot of those things are going to come to bear over the course of this year potentially. So we're in for an interesting ride in 2024.
Yeah, because I feel like at least on our network, there's a lot of talk about. There's always the first thing is AI jobs conversation, right? But even beyond that, there's a lot of conversations about how this impacts kind of business as usual or what have you. I really wonder though how much people aren't thinking through like real business model change, where the models that are kind of intact today may not be, and due to the accelerated nature of this stuff, this is not 10 years down the line, I don't think.
Well, interesting you say 10 years. You and I have been doing this around IRPA, the automation, for the last 10 years since RPA came out and was big. And I had this conversation with someone last week where they were talking about, well, we did digital transformation many years ago. And I asked, well, did you really? I mean, you might have implemented some software and made a few changes, but if you're Blockbuster, digital transformation is called Netflix, right? Real digital transformation is painful. And I don't think a lot of organizations went through necessarily that level of pain that it took to actually transform. They might have digitized some of the stuff that they were doing, or put things in an app instead of on a website. But did they really transform? I think a lot of organizations didn't, and that transformation, I think, is going to be coming here very shortly for many of them.
And even Alexa is not absolved from that. They're turning her in for a new model. Did you see that?
I saw some, well, yeah, but I also saw some rumors that Google is now recommending its cloud-based customers start moving off of their cloud or something to that effect. That was like individuals, not companies. But I thought that was pretty fascinating too.
Even Alexa's not safe. But to your point, right? I mean, a lot of the complaints, certainly I had, we spoke to the head of privacy from Alexa a number of months ago. It wasn't really the AI that we thought it was. It was great at language and understanding what you were saying, but that's kind of it. And so a lot of, according to this article, I found, who supposedly had an inside scoop to some employees at Amazon. There seems to be some contention going on as to, what this thing should actually be. Do we need another general AI tool, another ChatGPT thing, on demand, and are people willing to pay for it? But, you talk about the access that, Alexa has, right? I think that's maybe its biggest differentiator is, just what the adoption has been, of it. So now you take something, that's powerful, that, like a ChatGPT thing, that, okay, maybe the average, human outside of the business technology world doesn't know how to access, but, it's becoming more and more accessible, even to the masses, right? With things like Alexa, with Microsoft building it into, I think, every app that they've got now.
I think it's telling, and I'm looking forward to getting into this with our guests in a moment. But all of the new governance frameworks and regulations and so forth in AI, which you would think are more about focused on the analytics capabilities and the algorithms and so forth, one of the things that they all emphasize uniformly is ensuring privacy of individuals. And that's something that we've been concerned with for well over a decade now, but I think it's being brought even more to the fore because this stuff is being used for active training of things that are becoming decision-making devices. And that changes the game quite a bit. And I think that also ties off into a lot of the discussions people are having around property rights and who owns that intellectual property type stuff. There's going to be a lot of battles. And the thing is, it's going to be sort of like privacy was a good 10 years ago, where it's going to be very heterogeneous from one region to another, one jurisdiction to another. So it's going to be a little bit tough to navigate, I think, over the next couple of years.
Well, and it used to be like when I first got all my Alexas and my family members who were, a lot of cases older, right, generational thing. But you'd have these conversations where they're like, "Oh, I don't like the idea that it's always listening." And my response was, "Yeah, but what's it listening to? Like, what are you actually doing that you're so concerned about, other people having access to it?" As a technology guy who's usually a proponent of this stuff, it scares the what out of me that this thing has some kind of connection to ChatGPT, right? All of a sudden, it's not so isolated, right?
Well, it's the privacy paradox, which, again, talking about it for over a decade. I want my privacy, but I want really awesome coupons. You can't have it both ways. And we see it every day. You're sitting there typing in an email in a browser, and the thing that you just were searching for 5 minutes ago on a different platform is showing up in the upper right corner as an advertisement. Or you get in your car. This one still freaks me out. You get in your car, and it says it's going to take you 5 minutes to get to where you're going. How did you know that that's where I'm about to go? But it's accurate 99% of the time, and so we're well past the point of being able to kind of control it or to stop it. Now it's just how do we manage it, I think.
Yeah, but I'm okay with coupons. The next iteration, though, and I've spoken to a couple people recently who are writers, who are authors, who've told me that their content unpublished has ended up in ChatGPT corpus, right? So now all of a sudden, listen, the guardrails are, we're going to talk about it today, but for me, at least mentally, that was a new one where I'm like, whoa, okay, now I'm finally ready to say slow down, where all the people I've talked to over the last 4 or 5 years, I'm like, it's no big deal, right?
So that wasn't me that told you that, but that's happened to me as well. I've had people like contact me out of the blue. Hey, ChatGPT told me that you know about this stuff. Let's talk about it. Kind of freaky.
Interesting. Hey, Chris, the other seed I want to plan for you, I think we can touch upon it today from a regulatory standpoint, but I think it'd be worth a conversation in a future episode. I think, a lot of the conversation this year will, shift from, how do you regulate AI to how you power it. I saw a piece that Microsoft is actually considering nuclear power to satisfy its AI power needs.
As a writer, that headline I can read in a few different ways. Microsoft is going nuclear. That can mean a few different things.
Yeah, that's a good title. Good line. But and there's a data scientist in Amsterdam that found that the energy required, or estimates that the energy required to power AI globally is comparable to the energy consumption annually of the entire country of the Netherlands.
That's probably a low estimate, and it's getting a lot worse too. I think I saw, was it Amazon or Google just placed an order with NVIDIA for something like another billion GPUs or a couple 100,000 additional GPUs. We used to say this about blockchain, where Bitcoin, by the time it reaches its end of growth, it requires enough energy to like melt the surface of the planet. We're going to get there pretty quickly with this. And I did a calculation in an article I wrote I think last week, where something like yotta watt hours or zeta watt hours, it was an enormous amount, but we basically have to increase the amount of energy production in America by a third, I think was the expectation, because of AI over the next couple of years. Where's that going to come from? I mean, that's a lot of windmills if we think we're going to do it with renewables. So
yeah. Well, according to this article, Google's annual electricity usage before ChatGPT and Bard and was like twice as much electricity as the city of San Francisco. So that's the next piece, and then and we want to ask our guest, has got some experience with Homeland Security, but then there's that risk, right? The risk of, hey, how linked is our infrastructure to the compute and the intelligence, right?
Oh, and deeply intertwined. I mean, in terms of how do you effectively adopt the technology of AI and make use of it? A lot of people are, which platform should we use and so forth. I'm saying, okay, what happens if that system that you've come to depend upon is shut down for 3 days or 4 days? If you have a Texas snowstorm situation again, what is your backup plan? What is the resilience in your processes that you've handed off to automation? And if that automation goes away for a couple of days, do you lose your business? This has happened to businesses in the past. And the more you depend upon automation being there, the more painful it is when it's not.
Yep. Interesting. All right, Chris, with that, why don't you go ahead? I know you've done a lot of work with our guests here today, so I'll let you introduce them.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce Sultan Meghji and Nick Reese from a new company, which I'm happy to say that I'm part of, Frontier Foundry. Good morning, or I guess good afternoon, guys. How you doing? Oh, Sultan, you're on mute.
Hey, great to see you guys. Good morning. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, pleasure, Nick. Without further ado, I'll ask you to both introduce yourselves, a brief background, and a little bit, and then we'll get a little bit into what Frontier Foundry is focused on and what you're working on. Sultan, please.
Yeah, sure. So I'm the CEO, co-founder of Frontier Foundry. We started it early last year. Sorry, I keep forgetting it's 2024. Previous to that, I was the chief innovation officer at the FDIC, and then before that, ran a fintech and couple of decades of technology work going back to early research in artificial intelligence in the 1990s.
Excellent. And Nick?
Thanks, Chris. So my name's Nick Reese. I'm the co-founder and COO of Frontier Foundry. Partnered with Sultan, maybe more than a year ago, a couple of years ago now, as we talked about what this company would be, and we're excited to see where it's landed us. Before this, I was the director of emerging tech policy at the Department of Homeland Security in the headquarters building. And before that, I spent some time in the national security world and then the military as well. Glad to be here.
Great, guys. And to segue right into it, I mean, obviously, we're touching on some of the policy issues and so forth. There's two things I really wanted to focus in the discussion. And that is the Venn diagram, if you will, of this policy issue and regulatory compliance, and how do we ensure that we're using these technologies effectively. But then I also want to touch upon, because I know this is a big focus for you guys, what is the meaning of effectiveness, and how do we help organizations of all types actually put this technology to some meaningful, useful purpose? However you'd like to unpack that a little bit.
Asking a small question. Well, it's interesting. I think all of us here have been in some degree of a transformation role in our career, right? And I think a lot of people they think about transformation as a moment. It's like, oh, we're going to transform for a year or two, or we're going to be innovative for a year or two, and not realizing that it just has to be part of the DNA of an organization, right? And so to me, I would say AI, the current state of AI is really more broadly a digital transformation discussion. There's a lot of legacy technology that people are trying to use AI to mitigate that legacy. There's a lot of optimization they're trying to do. There's a lot of new value they're trying to create. There's a lot of human efficiency. But in all those cases, you're not really doing anything too differently than what we've been doing in digital transformation for decades now in technology. The difference is the technologies are far more complex and have far more capabilities. And so, as we think about the people framing it in their brains, I wouldn't say you need an AI transformation strategy. You need an overall digital transformation strategy for your organization. And AI is a piece of it right now. But, the biggest value that AI is really creating right now for a lot of organizations is around automation. And so, if you think about what we've tried to automate over the last few decades with technology, whether it's internal processes or customer interactions or whatever, there's a significant, I would say, a significant opportunity set, but there's also a lot of ground that's been covered that you can reuse. So I think that's kind of a sampling of a kickstart of the discussion. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yeah, I'll weigh in on that. I mean, people, when we're doing RPA, people are like, well, we're going to do automation. I'm like, as if it was the first time ever. I'm like, you've been automating since the 70s. That's what we've been doing with software. Yeah. So it's not necessarily something new. We're just doing it more emphatically with something that's more powerful. And I see you kind of nodding, Nick. Does that resonate with you as well?
Yeah, I think the thing that Sultan really talked about that I just kind of want to double click on is we talked about the optimization piece and we talked about human efficiency. And that was something that was really central to the founding of this company and the early success that we've had, is taking artificial intelligence and letting it do what it is good at so that humans can do what they are good at. And taking away some of that long rote work that is takes up a lot of time for people, but also is kind of prone to errors, especially when humans are doing it, and allow an AI algorithm to work that problem, but provide the output to a human for the ultimate decision. And I think that right there causes both human efficiency and optimization, and ultimately a lot of value for organizations.
So one of the things I always, hear, companies I think are going to really struggle with, I said to, I think you guys before we got on live that, if last year was the year of Gen AI, this is going to be the year of enterprise AI. as companies try to figure out the balancing act between implementing this stuff and putting the right guardrails in. I'm curious as to your opinions, and you guys have had extensive roles, but I know in your roles, Homeland Security, FDIC. I assume you leaned more towards conservative, but how do you balance that, right? How do you balance the regulatory, the compliance, the risk with innovation and the opportunity that this thing has without, because my concern always with regulation, right, is that it makes it to the point where you don't want to innovate anymore because the upside's too low.
I mean, it's a huge question, right? And so much of the regulatory environment we operate in, whether you're in the government or the private sector or elsewhere, is on regulations that predate these technologies, right? It predates a lot of the conversations we're having. And so you're trying to, in essence, square peg round hole this, right? And that's that'll have middling success, I think, in most cases. I think just broadly speaking, I would hope to see, like we've seen in Europe in particular, some sort of comprehensive, discussions around regulatory and governance issues at the legislative level. Here in the United States, we've seen some good stuff in Europe, and we're starting to see bits and pieces of this, right? There's been an executive order around artificial intelligence. The NIST has an AI risk framework within that part of it. But in terms of its applicability, I think you want to take a step back and think about what should you be doing versus what you have to do, right? And right now, what you should be doing is greater than what you have to do. The regulatory environment hasn't really set a lot of rules here in the United States, at least, on what you do and do not have to do in many cases, right? In some cases, it's, you can't use it for X or you can't use it for Y. But in other cases, it's like, well, you shouldn't use it at all. And that's, we know that that's not the case. There are a lot of usages of this technology out there that are well established, that are really quite valuable. And so as we work through this discussion, I would say, for organizations, if this is the year of enterprise AI, I would say understanding how to manage your AI implementations so that you can be prepared for upcoming governance or regulatory changes is going to be a key thing. I would say on the private sector side, I would hope to see organizations make this a board level discussion. Say, hey, listen, we have this inventory of artificial intelligence we're thinking of using. This is how we're managing it. This is how we're ensuring that it's not going to cause more risk than it alleviates, things like that. Knowing that there's a bit of a vacuum in terms of what, you might be hearing from your regulators or your or other governance mechanisms.
Yeah. So Dan, what I'll ask to add to that, first of all, is if anybody is listening that is a former coworker of mine or on my team, they probably laughed out loud when they heard you say, "Oh, you were in the government, so you were probably more conservative about this kind of thing." So first of all, if anybody laughed out loud, that's great. So I come at it from a little bit of a different standpoint, because the role that I was in was not a regulatory role, and so I was kind of sitting at the secretary level at the secretary office level at DHS, and from there, we were looking at the governance conversation, which is very, very different than the regulatory conversation. So I want to be clear that we're talking about governance, which is a much more kind of internal function, not regulatory, even though there's been some discussion about that, especially on the heels of the executive order. And from that perspective, we were thinking about governance as kind of a structure that would exist inside your organization and would fundamentally answer a really important question about the use of AI. And that is, should you use it? And if yes, under what conditions? And what's interesting, and I was in the room for some of these conversations really early on, where we were talking about how do we create a governance structure inside of DHS, for example, or really any organization. And a lot of people said, okay, well, let's slot it the kind of IT equipment procurement cycle, policy cycle. And that was interesting because in the government, right, it's governed by FISMA, and there's a bunch of requirements and things like that around, can you use a piece of equipment? Does it have the right security? Does it have the right specifications, whatever that is? And in the world of AI, I think we can't, the question is not, can you in terms of governance, but it's should you? And if yes, what do we need to do to ensure it's safe and trustworthy use? So you might say something like, well, yes, but we need quarterly audits of the data, or yes, but we need a different level of encryption, or whatever that might be. And so I think that the AI governance conversation is a really interesting one because it answers a different question than we're used to being asked, which is should versus can.
Yeah, really interesting. And I'm sorry to prejudge you, Nick, but the other part of it though is, so that's the government, right? I sometimes wonder, you hear about, the Googles and the Amazons of the world. I often wonder if their, unpublished perspective is let's do what we can get away with and then ask for forgiveness later. Do you agree with that, or am I just being cynical?
So I definitely can't speak on their behalf. I'm not entirely sure kind of what their internal policies look like. But what I can definitely say is there is a definite reputational risk when you talk about using AI, right? If you get it wrong, and this really fits into governance, if you get it wrong, there is a chance that you really erode your public trust. And working at DHS, this was something that we were really concerned about from the very beginning. I mean, I was actually in the room when we were doing the first draft of Executive Order 13960, which was an AI executive order that came out in 2020. And so in that executive order is all trustworthy principles for the use of AI in the federal government, right? Because executive orders apply to the government. And so we were talking about those kinds of trustworthy, trust issues. But I think where the conversation has changed, and this is where I think we see some organizations are a little bit behind, is they're very ready to talk about the risk of using AI. What happens if we get this wrong? Which is true, right? Which is why you need governance. But there's also another half of that, which is the risk of not using it and the reputational risk of not having AI or getting behind or suffering some kind of mistake or something that happens because you were not. And so that's where I think the conversation is evolving. And I think it's been really interesting, certainly since I was in government.
Tagging onto that just a little bit, I would say that, a lot of people who go into artificial or are starting to do stuff in artificial intelligence, and we've certainly seen people start to go down that path without a really good plan in some cases. And I'm speaking very broadly here, both public sector and private sector. One of the most interesting things that a lot of organizations seem to get to is realizing that when they say, oh, we want to do artificial intelligence, what they're really doing is trying to manage technical debt or trying to automate something. And that's just the tool they use. And so there are a number of places where there are more than a few opportunities for organizations to start to go down the path of creating value out of these discussions while they work through the process of deciding what their risk tolerance for artificial intelligence is, or what their risk tolerance for any sort of innovative program is. And so, for people listening to this, I would say, again, think about it holistically, think about your overall digital transformation and technical debt management programs, and make sure that you're setting yourself up for success, because a lot of the value that artificial intelligence is able to create right now is mirroring other technical advancements that are now creating a tremendous amount of value across the market. I'd say not really germane to the AI conversation, but if you look at some of the open source projects that have come out over the last 2 years, 3 years, certainly since COVID, there's incredible value that can be created. And with a single command line, you can do things in open source that used to take entire enterprise technology environments. And so the ability to get value and to kind of navigate that is right there for people. And so to kind of echo on Nick's point about should you or shouldn't you, it's also when is the right time to use it, and set yourself up to understand the risk, understand the value you're trying to create, and then turn that into something that you can execute against.
Yeah, and what I really like about what Sultan just said is he talked about basically what problem are you trying to solve? Is it your technical debt? Is it something else? And knowing what that problem is really helpful. And I've definitely been in a lot of different conversations where I've had people say to me, well, just add some AI to it. And you say, well, what is that? What does that mean? And they would just say, yeah, we just need a little AI, like we're seasoning a stew or something. And it was really, kind of frustrating because we didn't know what problem we were solving. And so if you don't know what problem you're solving, one, you don't know what success looks like. And two, how do you govern it? And so that governance structure also matters, that you can articulate what is the problem here, and what is the kind of expected output, and have we deviated from that expected output? So that identification of what is the problem is also another really important piece of this.
Nick, it's like add some AI. It's like buying a vowel on Wheel of Fortune, right? Just, the thing that comes to mind through this whole conversation is one that I had a couple of weeks ago, where we were asking a bunch of technologists, where was governance for AI sitting in the organization? And it was a mishmash. Most said either it sat within the CIO office, so it's perceived as a technical thing, sort of as you had insinuated, Nick, previously. And then others were saying, well, it was kind of in legal and compliance because it's more of a controls and regulatory sort of thing, sort of as Sultan, you were saying. But one of the most innovative responses we had in that whole group was one of the people said, our AI governance initiatives actually resides with the CHRO, the head of HR. The rationale being this is a talent and skill and workforce issue more than it is a technical issue or a controls issue. Does that kind of resonate with some of what you're seeing as well?
It's absolutely clear that one of the biggest concerns, and I think this is a reasonable concern from both the Biden administration as well as a lot of organizations, is what it means in terms of displaced people, because it's clear that so much of enterprise technology right now is focused on optimizing people, whether it's, back office functions, front office functions, whatever, right? Instead of, I think we're all old enough to remember the days when you needed tens or hundreds of people to run around a data center to keep it running. And nowadays, they're mostly entirely automated systems, and you go in every once in a while to pull out something in a rack or replace a cable, right? That's kind of the current state, right? And so as we look at where we are right now, I think I'd not heard about that. That's CHRO model. I thought that was super interesting. And if the AI projects are focused on, in essence, human capital activities, that's great. If you go back to the SAG-AFTRA stuff last year, I was thinking out loud with some friends, and I said, well, why don't the SAG negotiators just require that any AI that goes into Hollywood be a SAG member, and that the technology companies have to actually make themselves SAG members? So you move the onus of negotiation onto the other side. I think that's a little bit of a parallel to Chris, what you were just talking about.
Yeah, so I also hadn't heard the chief HRO kind of model either, but I can definitely speak from where does this land? I mean, we talked about this a lot, and so it was do we have this AI governance council, right? And we have this council, and who's on it, right? Is it at the undersecretary level? Is it at the director level? Like where do we land this? And then it was, well, who owns it? And Chris, you mentioned, is it kind of like the CIO? Is it somewhere else? And speaking just from kind of some very early observation, one of the things that I found was that kind of when you landed in the CIO world, you almost automatically add this kind of like procurement, as in like, can we question to the governance process? Of course, not across the board, but that was definitely the experience that I had. And so I think the real answer is it's probably, if we imagine like a council, it's probably a co-chair kind of thing, where you have folks from kind of the policy, maybe you even have like privacy, civil liberties, civil rights, civil liberties types, and then you also have to have tech types, and you could even structure it such that you have kind of the top decision-making body, but then you have like a technical support element under it. So there's a couple of ways to kind of think about this, but the workforce piece is absolutely critical. And that was something that when we were doing DHS's AI strategy, it was signed out in 2020. It's available online. You'll see that one of the 5 primary goals was workforce. And that's because that piece is really important. Now, do we land it in the chief HRO world? Maybe, but I can say that that part is definitely really important. It's something we recognized back when we were doing the strategy.
Dan, I think you would know this from all the interactions you have with certainly CTOs, CIOs. There's almost two ways that IT is generally perceived. It's either an efficiency play, how do I your mess for less almost through the technology, or there's an effectiveness play, how do I generate more value through the technology? And I'm wondering, with AI, is it just that, but more emphatically so because this is such a fast moving and powerful technology, or what are the potential other impacts there?
Oh man, you're setting me up. I'm going to say C, which is I'm going to get a lot of hate mail for this, but I see IT more and more as the blocker. You know, and we've talked about this, right, Chris? The incentive. If I'm the CIO, or if I'm the compliance guy, or if I'm the cybersecurity guy, what incentive do I have to change anything? It's not my business model that's at risk. It's not my revenue that's at risk. So, you know, I think it's changing. I hope it's changing where, you know, the culture is less about just, you know, and that's why I asked that question before to these guys about, you know, innovation versus holding back, because I think so many of the IT organizations out there are, you know, they're pulled into the CEO's office when something breaks or something gets exposed, not because they're not playing nicely enough with the more innovative teams.
Sultan, you kind of like, I know you're specifically focused on how do you get organizations to achieve that value from this technology and not just sort of play with it. Do you have like a top 3 greatest hits on how to make that happen more effectively?
Well, you know, when Dan was speaking, I didn't want to agree with him. I wanted to kind of find a good nudge there. And I would say, if you wanted to ask that question a slightly different way, I would say, what are the top 3 ways to make sure you're not going to immediately fail instead of top 3 ways you'll be successful? One of them would have to be, you know, whole organization, you know, engagement, right? And that includes IT, the business units, leadership, governance, you know, whatever. It's, I think, very difficult nowadays to untangle from so many, especially the largest organizations, all the different kind of siloed processes and stakeholders that are out there. And the challenge with AI is the value, the opportunity, the shiny object that everybody's looking for is in conflict with that siloed mentality. And so you have to think again holistically about it. You know, 2 other ways to not immediately fail would be to have domain experts and AI people and your technology people, you know, kind of all on the same team, all working together, having IT over here doing their thing and the business unit over here doing their thing, and, you know, kind of having it all separated. And that's kind of a recipe for at best incremental value. And I think in many cases it's a project that is exciting and interesting, but doesn't go anywhere. Like a lot of pilots, you know, you see a lot of big enterprise organizations do pilots, and for the most part, they're designed not to actually turn into anything big and meaningful, right? They're designed to be very tactical. And then the third would be making sure that the projects you're picking, the work you're doing actually has direct tangible value, like in a near term, not a 3-year project, not a 2-year consulting engagement that ends up in a PowerPoint presentation. You know, have it turn into something in a less than 12-month kind of, you know, timeline. And if you can do that, then I think you can do those 3 things, then you have an opportunity to do something. You know, I would say, given the power of so many of these technologies, going from 0 to at least some degree of value created in months is far more doable now than it was a few years ago. And that's not just AI, but I think AI is probably the biggest benefactor of that technology expansion.
You know, when Dan was talking there, he talked about getting pulled into the CEO's office for, you know, getting into trouble. And I thought, my first thought was, boy, do I know how that is. But no, you know, I think what I would add there is workforce. And so I think the workforce education piece is so critical here. And I would really push it toward kind of like professional upskilling. So bringing in, you know, these kind of limited number synchronous, asynchronous courses that you can bring people in, and you can educate them on kind of, I actually even start with what AI is and what it isn't, right? What it can do, what it can't, what it's good at, what it's not, and just start there. And so, you know, the reason behind this is if we're gonna, as an organization, if we're thinking about bringing in AI to automate some process or create some value, in most cases, those initial use case ideas are going to come from the people that are working in the organization, that have their hands on the problem, that are doing the work every day. And if those people aren't, you know, at least I'd say more AI literate than kind of the mean, you know, I think that would be, you know, you're going to miss out on opportunities. And so again, this goes back to risk of not using it, right? Where you have people who are identifying use cases inside your organization, but you have no ability to kind of get there. there's a risk to that. And if you provide the right kind of education, then I think you will find your organization will be healthier and be better positioned to start to accept this kind of technology. And I always lean back on the education piece. I have to, full disclosure, I am a professor at New York University, so I do kind of lean on that a little bit. But I do think organizationally, there's a lot of value to be created if you institute that.
Sultan, I wanted to ask you too, knowing you spent a lot of time in the banking space, right? Another area that's historically conservative, but also that's been disrupted by all these, internet banks and born digital, companies. Is the propensity for more aggressive innovation happening within the banks, or are they still large? And then you add the pandemic thing, right? Where I'm like, I was speaking to a buddy of mine this week. He goes, "Oh, I had to go to the bank. I was there for 3 hours." I'm like, "Why?" He's like, "I'm opening an account." I'm like, "I opened 3 accounts like during the pandemic without ever going into a bank."
Yeah. It's interesting. I think over the last few years here in the United States, and the US is kind of characteristically different than the rest of the world in terms of its banking system. And so I think I'll answer for the United States and kind of, we can talk about the rest separately, but over 70% of consumer deposits in the United States live in less than 20 banks, right? And there are about 4,400 banks in the United States right now. And so, you have a very small number of organizations, both in terms of the banks and their technology providers, that, really kind of own that. And they're quite conservative. And the regulatory environment, it kind of endorses that. And it wants them to be conservative. It wants the banking system, the phrases, to be safe and sound. And so what's happened over the last few years is a big kind of a layer onion around it has been created amongst fintechs and smaller tech companies that create those kind of digital onboarding activities or any of these other digital activities. And there's a lot of infrastructure there. There's probably 10 times as many fintechs in that space here in the US as there are actual banks doing that kind of work. And so there's quite a lot there. And what it does is it allows you to go onto a web page and sign up for a bank account, and that can take 90 seconds. But then the exact same thing causes you to walk into a branch and see fax machines and things like that. And I don't actually foresee that structure changing. You leave the United States, and there are tremendous opportunities and tremendous activities around native digital banking, where the banks themselves are digital activities. And you see some even central banks experimenting with blockchain technologies and things like that. And as we continue to kind of figure out how to navigate that universe here in the US, I think it'll be interesting to see, how banks modernize, because for the most part, they do need to modernize. That's not really an AI question. It's not really a cloud question. It's really just we're on very old technology and we need to modernize. Banking cores are historically old fashioned systems. Most of them are 15 years old or better. And so you're starting to see just in the last year or two, some of the bigger banks start to modernize their core systems. And, we'll have to see how that goes. A lot of it's in flight right now. It's not a clear, there's not a clear path there, and I've got pretty good visibility to some of those projects. And you've got quite a, I think, interesting moment in time as we watch these projects go and we see whether they're successful or not. And I think some organizations are going to be very successful and some aren't. Now you take a step back from banking, Dan, and you talk just about like overall digital transformation. Some organizations are going to be very successful at that, and they're on the S&P 500 and they'll be on the S&P 500 for 50 years. But then there are other organizations that are going to struggle with this and struggle with that transformation journey. And they're going to, at some point, somebody else is going to come and figure out how to compete with them at a better margin, or with more innovative products, or something that's more fit relative to their customers, or something that's, more innovative that kind of geometrically changes that value curve. And so it's not just banking, but that kind of onion approach, you see it in other markets that are regulated, like healthcare is an example too.
But I wonder though if the opportunity, where it does relate to AI, is where the opportunity with AI is it allows a much smaller, tech savvy, born digital competitor to leapfrog maybe a larger institution, because they're maybe less risk averse, more technology centric, and now can accelerate so much quicker using AI. No. It's
interesting. I think there's an interesting chart that I haven't seen written well yet, but it basically says that because the value is so high, the risk therefore is equally high. And so much of that is around artificial intelligence right now. Just imagine you're a massive hedge fund and you can get rid of half of your trading staff. Well, human capital in a hedge fund is some of your most expensive, top line, resources. So you drop that by 15%. That's your best year ever. You return money to your investors. And in the current market, I don't think there's a single investor that wouldn't mind getting a little money back or a little more upside. So, until we figure out as a civilization how to internalize AI, and it's really two things. One is accept that there are a lot of things that people are saying are AI that aren't AI, and just kind of what the definition of AI is, right? Because a lot of it's just marketing right now, right? Yep. And the second is how we get comfortable with technologies making decisions on its own. And that's really the big change. It's not happening too much right now, but when I see the traffic light go from green to amber to red, like I know that that's just programmed in, and there's a timer, right? And that if an ambulance is driving by, that'll change that sequence. But otherwise, that's some guy wrote that code, and and they've done some math on it, right? If all of a sudden we said we're going to have AI traffic lights to optimize traffic flow, all of a sudden I'm like, well, will the AI like arbitrarily change everything to red just for 5 seconds because it sees there's a lot of angry drivers, that kind of thing. I think we have to get it so that people like my mom or children are like, I think children are actually way more comfortable than we are, but like people who aren't technologists, people who aren't listening to a podcast like this, get comfortable with technology making decisions for them. And that to me is kind of the biggest human question mark we have right now, is how do we do that? I'm not sure we have a good answer there yet.
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting. You talked about like where we are as a society about like AI making decisions, and this was another central piece to the governance conversation. And when I was at DHS, I remember having conversations. People would say, "Well, didn't DoD just do something with AI governance? What did they do?" And I was like, "Well, it doesn't matter what they did, because we have very different authorities, responsibilities, oversight, everything else that lands on us, like as DHS, very, very different." And so, we had this kind of conversation where we would say, well, we have people's personal data, civil rights, civil liberties implications around some of these things. And are we prepared to use AI around to make some of these decisions? And there's a lot of questions around governance and things like that. But what we said was, we cannot have it be, well, you aren't allowed on this flight. Well, why aren't I allowed on this flight? Well, because the box says so. Well, what did the box say? I don't know, but the box says so, right? So we had to really think about this kind of, again, back to this can versus should conversation. And if yes, under what conditions? And so we have to look at, I think, a couple of things. One is the level of automation that we're talking about, right? So we've probably heard the, human in the loop, human on the loop, human out of the loop, right? As an example kind of framework. And then we talk about the impact. So are we talking about someone, might have a slightly longer wait time when they're on hold, or are we talking about someone might not be able to board a flight, or are we talking about someone's life? And so, really kind of fine tuning those dials for you matters. But it also matters because it is highly dependent on your organization. So it's not going to be something that we can say, all right, here it is. Here's a fully baked model. What we're going to have to do instead is come in and sort of look at your organization and say, okay, like where are your risks, your public trust risk, your reputation risk? What type of implications do you have? And then build a governance model around that. And so it matters kind of who you are and how you're using it and what those implications are.
I'm wondering, guys, as we talk about a more, regulation-centric climate this year, the EU, has this very comprehensive AI regulation. You guys have talked about some of the executive orders and things. I think one of the concerns that a lot of people have about regulation in general is that they feel, especially in the business community, that the people that are doing the regulating don't have a good sense for what it's like to be the ones innovating. And so I'm curious, what's your sense as to, is there collaboration around AI between the government agencies and private industry? And is there any connection, any international cooperation to link that regulation worldwide and avoid this? Well, I'm just going to move operations over here to avoid the regulation, in the U.S.
That's a great question. I think we're seeing some collaboration, which is great. And there's at the international level. I would equate what the EU is doing with AI very similar to what they did with GDPR. And so, we saw GDPR get created, and then it kind of flowed out, and then people kind of added on to or adopted it in bits and pieces, or in some cases wholesale, or created mirrors. The European regulatory environment and the American regulatory environments are quite different, right? European is highly centralized. We are highly decentralized here. And so, the mechanisms are really quite, they're, I would say, not necessarily always compatible. The great thing is because of all the innovation in AI here, we're seeing great innovation around governance and trustability and things like that, and how to build trustworthiness. And we've got the NIST AI risk framework, which has created a really great discussion in DC for people to work on. On the overall side, I think, I worry about having technical domain experts inside those meetings. There are a lot of things that I worry about what the end state legislation or rules would be. So, for example, there's a lot of talk about foundational models. Foundational models is a catchphrase around AI governance and regulation. And that phrase is meaningful, but only if you're talking about very, very large models, things like what OpenAI is doing, or Anthropic, or Meta, or people like that. There are orders of magnitude more organizations using much smaller models that would not be considered foundational. So if you anchor a governance or regulatory regime around foundational models, you're missing a lot of places where there is a lot of activity. And frankly, moving faster. And so I would say it is I think, going to end up being complicated for us over the next few years until we get enough people educated about AI, and educated to a point where they're not just, mimicking the words, right? They actually understand it. They understand what the impact is, and understand the broad spectrum use cases. And I'll give you a great example. The CFPB is very concerned, rightly so, that AI would be used in a discriminatory manner against credit and lending decisions, especially for underserved and underrepresented populations. We don't want to make it harder for people who it's already hard to get a mortgage, right? The challenge is a lot of the discussions around are how do you keep AI from doing it versus, well, isn't there an opportunity for AI to identify that kind of discrimination in the system already? And then AI can just flow into that same governance model, right? And therefore there's it doesn't matter how the decision is being made. It can be a guy sitting at a desk. It can be a black box, as long as it is an auditable decision that can be, kind of managed the right way. Great. We're not there yet in terms of the discussion. I hope we get there soon. I'm not super confident we'll get there this year, though.
So I'm going to be the kind of the optimist in the room, and at least for part of your question here. So I think when it comes to collaboration between government and private sector, and I would put academia in the same sentence. Could cooperation, information sharing, things like that be better? Of course, and we should always strive for that. But I think at the end of the day, we all want the same things. I mean, none of us are rooting for the malicious cyber actor, right? We all want to find good ways to get this done. And in my experience, there were a lot of collaboration, a lot of conversation, a lot of initial sharing of ideas when it came to some policies and things that we were working on. And I think the key here is that we have to start all speaking kind of the same language. And I think that really goes back to the workforce piece of it, because we have to make sure that, if you're on the government side of things, you understand where kind of the private sector side is coming from, and vice versa. And I think if we can all kind of say, like, all right, we do want to march in the same direction, we want some of the same things, we can find ways to find, governance structures or other things that are going to work to give us, more trust in the way that we're using the technology, or whatever, value looks like in your organization.
I wanted to ask you guys too about we've touched upon the workforce question a couple times. I often wonder, and it's maybe an unfair question in the sense that, you get caught up in the media and the politics and all those sorts of things. But, how much is the government considering the impact on the broader workforce of this? Because you see things that I think are just, hot button issues around, labor unions and manufacturing jobs and those sorts of things, but not as much about, hey, what happens if the models shift, if the businesses change, if we do need less people, at least in certain segments of the economy because of technology like AI. Please tell me that we're a little bit further along than it seems like from the outside.
The IMF just put out a really good blog about a week and a half ago or something that said that they think that something like 40% of jobs will have some degree of impact from artificial intelligence in the coming years. And I think I put on Twitter or something, I was like, I'm not sure it's that low. And it's just like my data center example, right? Or QA guys, back 20 years ago, I had a development team and there was a QA team that sat right next to my development team and they were basically the exact same size. And now that doesn't exist in the same way. We've changed how we operate software development organizations. We've changed how we operate data centers. And, I think we'll see the same thing. The difference here is with AI, it's not just going to be people in IT departments that could conceivably be impacted. You think about what a car plant in Detroit in the 60s looked like versus what it looks like today. Like one of these new Tesla plants, right? For example, that has a very small number of humans inside it, operating it. That kind of human capital change is bound to occur. The job of guy who drives horse-drawn carriage hasn't existed for a while. Very small number of people know how to shoe a horse anymore, right? The challenge in this case is instead of it taking a generation or two to go through these technical changes, it's happening in months or small years, right? And that's the thing I think we're struggling with. And it's a huge topic of conversation. I think, it comes up in the universe Nick and I live in on a daily basis, frankly. The question is going to be, what actually gets done. And that's, I think, outside of certainly my remit to hypothesize.
Yeah. So much. I agree with so much that Sultan just said, and I think it really does have to do with like Sultan talked about people that can shoe horses, right? As someone who's in the Navy, I used to say, the Navy used to build ships out of wood, right? And we no longer have as many sail makers, right? And there's so many examples of exactly that. But I think that ultimately we're headed toward augmentation first. So we're doing some automation of some tasks. And then we're headed toward augmentation. And so when you read something about 40% or higher of jobs are going to be impacted by AI, I think we have a tendency to read that as they're going to take away the jobs. Like that's our immediate reaction. But that actually might not be the case. And one of the examples that I give people a lot is imagine that you never had to fill out a travel voucher ever again for your job, right? What if we could just automate that? Or what if you were given, 1,000 pages, maybe you're an attorney or a paralegal, you're given 1,000 pages of discovery that you have to read over the weekend. Well, what if instead of you spending all that time reading and potentially missing things because we're all humans, instead you could take that down to, a few minutes and allow an AI to summarize it. And if you're not happy with it, you have it summarize it again. And you can do some different things like that. I think that those are not ultimately bad things, but they are changes. And just like, we had to look at, people that, used to make sales and we had to think about, a different way to employ them. We're going to have to do some similar things, but I don't think it's quite as extreme because hopefully what happens in a lot of these jobs is that a lot of these rote tasks get taken off of you and you're allowed to apply your expertise.
Yeah. I mean, the sale making one is a great example, right? Like I would prefer to have somebody who's an expert sale maker focus on making sure that it's exactly the right shape and installed correctly and that, it's kind of made to the highest possible standards our civilization can make it versus, running a pair of scissors. I don't know if they do that. I know very little about sale making, but something like that.
Chris, we got about a minute left. Any final questions for our guests?
No, great input, guys. Where can people find you if they want to learn more?
Frontierfoundry.com is the easiest place.
Also, check us out on LinkedIn and Substack.
Guys, thank you so much. I hope we can have you back on the show again. This was probably a 4-hour conversation. We tried to keep that to an hour, but appreciate your insights and your time. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks, guys.
Chris, great discussion this week. And, I feel slightly more optimistic than when we started. So I guess that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think the key takeaway, and you and I saw this all the time with RPA, everyone was thinking of replacement, supplant rather than supplement. And I think the organizations that we saw that were really successful with RPAs were the ones that were supplementing people in the work that they did with the technology. So they achieved sort of a resonance there, as opposed to saying, what percentage of my workforce can I get rid of?
Yeah.
And I think we're going to see the exact same effect here. It's just going to happen a lot faster. I mean, you have to remember, ChatGPT in particular, it's a year old, right? It's gone out of its infancy, and now we have a toddler. And the challenge is, how do we make sure it doesn't enter its terrible twos this year? It actually kind of starts to learn and be pleasant to be with and kind of fun to be around. So I think that's what we're really going to face in 2024 is, as it matures, as we bring it more into the organization, how do we use it to enhance what people do? Not so much focus on how do we replace people as quickly as possible with it.
Yeah. Well, go to irpaai.com, join our free membership, or schedule a complimentary briefing with one of our subject matter experts. In the meantime, we'll be back week after next, Wednesday live, noon Eastern, 9 Pacific. Chris, have a great week.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.